Fintech Chatter TV. Presented by Tier 1 People. Leaders in Fintech Executive Search.
Finmo is solving essentially treasury management for global businesses. So our philosophy internally is everyone has a treasury problem. And from our point of view, over the last 20 years, the founding team has sort of been seeing the same types of problems with mid-market sort of enterprise. And so what that is essentially treasurers and CFOs trying to manage their cash on a regional and global basis, but doing it with sort of disparate tools and through kind of disjointed banking sort of relationships. So we're trying to bring that all together into a single platform. Yeah, it's an interesting area in that it feels like because of that environment, we've seen a heightened sort of focus on kind of the traditional treasury management sort of processes and solutions. And what I mean by that is we had a run on banks in the US a couple of years ago. We had the interest rate pieces that we're seeing sort of around the town. And I think for global organizations where they're working across different currencies, jurisdictions, that adds to that complexity. And what we found is that a lot of treasurers and CFOs actually work again with different solutions that don't talk to one another. So what Finmo is doing is we're actually bringing the pieces of the puzzle together. We can get into a little bit later, but we sort of manage that through kind of a modularized approach, right? So if treasurers want money movement capabilities, if they want cash management, sort of yield opportunities, if they want FX hedging, if they want us to help integrate into their ERP tools, we can provide different sort of solutions for the different problems. But one of the things is, regional and global organizations have 10, 15 bank accounts all around the world. I mean, one of the things that we saw with the potential run on the banks is CFOs would say to their treasurers, hey, can you, mitigate the risk by spreading the cash into different banking sort of environments because they didn't want that risk happening. And so with that, I think we saw a greater need for bringing kind of cash management balances together where they download it into Excel, manipulate it intraday and figure out where it is, through a manual process. So we're trying to automate, all of that. Essentially.
I remember back in the GFC, right, one of the big four banks almost went out of business because of an Excel spreadsheet, right? It's and kind of treasury and positions being on an Excel spreadsheet. So
for sure.
It's a very, very risky game. There's obviously a lot of payments businesses around who are fixing and doing a really good job of fixing the problem of multi-currency and giving smaller businesses access to that. Sounds like you're doing something a bit different and you're targeting more the kind of bigger end, medium-sized kind of corporations. Is that right?
Yeah, correct, Dexter. I think, what we would say, and we talk about it again internally as sort of generation 2, is really about multi-currency, moving money from A to B. We think we're the next generation of kind of fintech in that we're not just doing multi-currency, we're sort of allowing organizations to bring sort of balances together so they can holistically see where they are. They can run accounts payable and receivable processes within that environment, and then they can hedge their risk. If they're a dollar-based company, but you're working regionally with Thai baht, Filipino peso, all these minor currencies, you need to hedge your risk against, that fluctuation, right? And so I think what we're doing is we're moving away from just the traditional A to B money movement. We're actually providing additional, sort of value on top. I mean, we can certainly do money movement. We are licensed in a range of countries which we can get into. And we have 180 sort of locations where we can sort of pay into. But, for us, that's not the focus of what we are doing.
Right.
And certainly many customers come to us for that component.
Yeah.
Because I think we're also pretty competitive there. But at the end of the day, I think it's that additional treasury value that we're adding on top, I think is relatively unique.
Well, there's a few things that you've just mentioned there that I think kind of really come into, some of the next questions that I've got. So the first one is you mentioned there, you're almost like FinTech 2.0. And I think one of the concerns that I have of the Australian FinTech scene at the moment is I think that we're kind of still very much stuck in FinTech 1.0 thinking. And what I mean by that is something that you touched upon where, multi-currency, it's a feature, it's not an app in itself or a business in itself. And I think that kind of evolution is really, I'm not seeing it at the minute where, and certainly it's great to have you on the show to talk and see that, there are businesses out there that are starting to evolve and think beyond, and it's not a bad way to go. You look at the success that Revolut has had by starting that way, but there has to be a bigger kind of picture. And it sounds almost like you're kind of the super app, but for treasurers and CFOs.
Yeah, no, look, it's really interesting. I think we've sort of had a lot of conversations with, big end of town sort of enterprise again that are sort of watching this space quite closely. Mid-market I think is what we're initially targeting. So our typical customer is a regional or global outfit that essentially has multiple bank accounts through multiple org structures within the region.
Yeah.
If you think about that as a starting position, they would struggle in understanding cash positions at any one point in time. That's essentially what we're solving for.
Yeah.
I think to your point, the traditional kind of fintech is more about how do I collect money in a various market and then pay it into another market.
Yeah.
That's multi-currency.
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is sort of evolve in terms of, companies are typically global or regional from day one. That's how they think today.
Yeah.
So it's changed from the traditional model of setting up in one market, then hacking away and sort of moving to another market, etc. I think most organizations want to be regional from day one, right? So we're sort of providing that context from day one that allows, again, these mid-markets to sort of solve some of their treasury needs. I think we also solve the kind of traditional model because, as I say, we've started with money movement. In order to solve treasury, you also need to move money near real time between banking institutions, etc. So I think we've worked pretty hard over the last 3 years to acquire licenses, become directly integrated into banking infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But I think, we're kind of thinking about the problem in a different way.
Now you talked there about businesses have to think globally, regionally from day one.
Yeah.
You spent a lot of time in Singapore. The business is based in Singapore, is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
What was the thinking around Singapore?
Yeah, so interesting
Stupid question.
Interesting question. I think for most of my career, of which it spans the last couple of decades, I think I've worked through Asia, through the US, had sort of dealings with Europe, etc. I think for us, we wanted to solve treasury for the region. And I think Singapore is a natural choice in terms of a regional headquarters. Some of the markets like Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, very difficult if you don't have kind of local expertise on the ground to sort of understand each of the markets. So, whilst Australia is a very important market for us, I think from a regional hub perspective, it made a lot more sense to base out of Singapore.
Yeah.
And, most of our team are sort of up there from an exec perspective, and we also have a development center in Bangalore in India.
Yeah.
So I think having access to our development center, our engineers, out of Singapore, I think made a whole heap of sense.
Yeah. And with the customers that you've got, are you kind of focused on certain segments, or are you just focused on a certain size of customer?
Yeah, so we actually see ourselves as segment agnostic.
Right.
What I mean by that is because we've integrated into sort of the infrastructure, kind of at the bare metal, anyone can essentially utilize our service, right? And because we've also thought about it in a modularized approach, if you just want to use the traditional rails of moving money from A to B and multi-currency, etc., you can do that. If you want to sort of utilize the treasury services, you can do that.
Yeah.
If you want to utilize FX hedging, AR, AP module, etc. I mean, we're kind of agnostic to what you want to sort of use us for. Having said that, I mean, we obviously have a target few segments that we go after, because we think that the treasury problem for those segments is much more prominent. So, frankly speaking, we actually see a lot of demand come from financial services organizations, whether it be other fintechs, payment players, etc. And again, if you think about the problem, I think it's really about organizations that may not have thought of, hey, how do I manage my cash properly? Where is it coming from in terms of customer base, etc. A lot of fintechs don't necessarily start out thinking about that problem.
Yeah.
They think about the value proposition that they can provide and how they're going to succeed and their runway and so on and so forth, rather than thinking, hey, I've got currency coming in from multiple different locations. How do I actually get ahead of managing that in a productive way? So we're seeing a lot of demand come from other payment players in that regard as well.
And how have you got the product out to market? Because it doesn't sound like it's a, put a website up, get lots of people come through the funnel. This seems like more of a high touch, longer sales cycle style product.
For sure. So we actually started sort of working through the licensing infrastructure over the last few years. So we've taken a lot of time to ensure that we're regulated in the key regions. So we're regulated in Australia, in New Zealand, in Singapore. In the US, we're an MSB. And we're actually 6 weeks out from becoming a UK EMI.
Oh, great.
Which is good. And so that was a lot of the initial sort of time that we took to establish the business across the different regions. And then it was working directly with banking infrastructure.
Yeah.
Ensuring that we're connected directly to the core rails, whether it be MPP here in Australia or PayNow in Singapore, faster payments in the UK, SEPA in Europe, etc. There was a lot of time spent making sure that those components were ready. And so we actually started with the money movement capability, had merchants and customers test our pipes. And we found that adding the treasury on top meant that, they could see the additional value, again, back to the earlier comment, of not just working through kind of that generation 2 fintech that's traditional money movement, but actually getting some value on top of that in terms of treasury. So it was pretty natural, I think, for kind of our evolution into treasury and providing those services to our customers. But we haven't done any much above the line marketing. It's really just been through kind of founder network, the industry contacts that we've had, etc.
Yeah, awesome. How big are you now in terms of people and number of clients, etc.?
Yeah, so we're around 40 to 45 people now. And, from our point of view, we've grown pretty rapidly in the last, sort of 18 months, I would say. I think from a customer base point of view, we've actually had a couple of hundred sort of merchants sign up to the platform, right? So we're pretty blessed in that regard.
Yeah.
I think from our point of view, we've got about 100 active merchants that are working with us sort of month on month.
Yeah.
It varies in terms of how merchants work with us. Some merchants work with us in a kind of couple of transactions a month sort of way to very active merchants.
Yeah.
So when we say 100 active, that's where they're working with us every day.
Yeah.
They're moving money. They're working with us on the treasury platform, etc. So yeah.
And what kind of feedback have you had from clients so far?
Look, pretty positive feedback from clients. I think we've instigated things like quarterly business reviews with our clients. Constant feedback in terms of how we can improve our platform, the UI, the API connectivity, etc. But I think overall it's been pretty positive. I think we've taken a stance that we want to work directly with treasurers and CFOs in building the product, because we want to solve directly with those stakeholders.
Globally, how much this is potentially worth in terms of a market?
the market is pretty big in our minds. So we're, as you mentioned, B2B focused.
Yeah.
And in our minds, B2B based on, reports and surveys that have been conducted is $150 trillion opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So the size is pretty big in terms of, the payment volume and the problem that we're tackling in terms of treasury. I think for us, the focus is definitely on Asia. There's probably been other like-minded companies in the US that are tackling it from a slightly different perspective. They look at it more from a perhaps traditional open banking point of view, where you can sort of pull in, cash balances, etc., but you can't necessarily move funds, within that environment, right? So what we're doing is we're doing the opposite, which is because we've directly integrated from an infrastructure perspective, we're also able to get access to balances and some of the services that we need. Look, I think in our mind that the opportunity is pretty big. I think we want to focus on Asia. The reality is that in Singapore, if you work with the top 3 banks, a bit like Australia, pretty open in terms of top 3 banks cover 80 to 90% of the market, right, from a mid-market point of view. So.
You mentioned earlier you'd just come back from a trip. You'd done Money 2020 in Asia, Money 2020 in Amsterdam. Anything that you've seen there that you're kind of excited about, or it's got you kind of a bit worked up? And
For sure. I think what excites me is everyone has a treasury problem.
Right.
So we've spoken to small, medium and large, and everyone actually says the same thing, right? We're actually downloading into Excel, we're sort of manipulating intraday, etc. It's the same conversation time and time again. So frankly, that excites me in that I think our kind of way of thinking has been validated a lot through kind of those conferences, etc.
I mean, it's always a good party, but what was the sense that you got of where kind of the industry's at this moment in time? People optimistic? Are they kind of pessimistic? Are we kind of feeling like we kind of got through the worst of it and it's moving forward? What was your sense as to how people were generally feeling?
I think people were generally positive, right? I think the sentiment is turning around. Right? I think people are feeling like we went through the dark days of COVID and all the stuff that came with that, etc. And things are moving now in a better direction. Is it 100% the right direction? Perhaps not. We still have a lot of macro kind of activities happening around the world, but it's certainly moving, I think, in the right direction. And we got that vibe from most customers and partners and so on. I think one of the things is, again, if you think about Asia, even in sort of Money 2020 Asia as well as Europe, US folk would come across to the Asia conference and not expect that there'd be so many complexities with Asia, right? A lot of US or European sort of customers perhaps think there's one way of doing things in Asia, as opposed to quite a few local nuances through the region, right? Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, they've all got different sort of infrastructure that's required. So we heard a lot of that, which we knew, but again, trying to solve the complexity of local market across Asia, I think was a key theme. I think the other thing is, as I jokingly said, everyone has a treasury problem. A lot of payment companies, financial services companies are wanting us to help solve this problem for them. It's taking up too much of their time. It's becoming more and more complex the more global they become and the more partners they work with across banking and so on and so forth. So again, it validated a lot of our thesis and thinking. So we're very, very positive about kind of the outcomes, for sure.
Before we wrap up, David, I think it's kind of common knowledge, that anybody who's setting up fintech in Australia has to be thinking global from day one. What advice would you give to Aussie founders who are looking to expand, and maybe go to Asia, Singapore, US, where you've done? What would be your kind of advice on just how to get things moving and get that off the ground?
For sure. I think one of the things is local expertise, right?
Yeah.
So a bit like what I just said with, some of our kind of customers coming from offshore into Asia, I think you've really got to have that sort of local knowledge of how the different markets sort of operate, and the complexities, right? Whether that be from a commercial point of view or regulatory one, there's a lot of different local nuances. And so thinking that you can just hop into Asia in the same way that perhaps you've done it locally in Australia, I think needs some further thought.
Yeah.
And you need to really think about kind of market by market,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to it's one big market, let's just hop in and sort of hope for the best. So my advice is definitely surround yourself with local expertise, right? Whether it be, help from kind of broader advisors that you can tap into that have local knowledge of, the Asia sort of presence, etc., or, recruiting, right, at the right time. Now, obviously, as a fintech, you can't sort of recruit across all markets at once. So my second bit of advice is start with a market, sort of understand that market and go deep into that market rather than, spread your kind of focus across the region and you're not then able to sort of accomplish what you need to.
Awesome. We get lots of great talent listening to this podcast, watching the videos. If anybody likes what they've heard about Finmo, they're interested in careers, what's the best way for them to find out about jobs with the business?
For sure. So finmo.net.
Yeah.
Or my email, which is david@finmo.net, which is pretty easy to remember. But certainly keen for, talent, people that like work.
Maybe we get CFOs listening to this as well. Yeah.
Correct.
So
and also from a market kind of feedback perspective, we'd love to hear from people that kind of have these problems on a day-to-day basis and, would like to solve it with us.
Fintech Chatter TV. Presented by Tier 1 People. Leaders in Fintech Executive Search.